Today, we're talking about why anxiety sometimes doesn't respond to therapy or medication or even prayer, and what deeper drivers may be keeping people stuck. So, Beatty, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Drew. I'm glad to be here.
So, let's just dive right in. Many people struggling with anxiety feel like they're doing everything right. They're doing therapy, they're taking medication, they're even praying, but they still feel stuck. Why does that happen?
It's really interesting when you really start to get into anxiety. Um, the main thing that's going on is a lot of times we're trying to solve anxiety from the outside in, and anxiety is actually something that's emanating from the inside and popping out. And the best way that I can describe it, and I deal with this a lot, is if you think about a yard, you have this beautiful green yard and you have this one weed coming up right in the middle, and it just drives you nuts. So the therapy, the medication, the proper thinking, the staging of everything in your life that we're told to do a lot of times is equivalent to me getting the lawnmower out and I cut my yard, cut right over the weeds, and now you can't see it. It's all masked. It's gone. And everyone comes by my yard and they, oh, you got such a beautiful yard. Yeah, isn't it beautiful? But by tomorrow or the next day, that weed's cropping back up. And it doesn't matter how much effort I put on the outside, on the surface of what's going on with my anxiety. The problem is it's something underneath the surface. And just like with that weed example, until you get the root and remove the root of the weeds, it keeps coming up. It's no amount of effort that you put on the top surface that's ever going to get rid of it. And this is actually interesting enough, Drew, is it's not only anxiety. This is anxiety. This is depression. This is just your mind constantly racing all the time.
Sure.
It could be like even things like ADHD. We're taking medication. We try different processes that people tell us to do. What I'm finding is once you get that root out of the way, it's gone. Like with anxiety, real interesting. A lot of times people say that anxiety is permanent, especially the healthcare system today. And I was visiting with a friend. I was actually on the prayer line of my church, and this guy comes up. He's just an acquaintance of mine. And he said, can you pray for me because I'm being eaten up with anxiety? And I said, well, tell me a little bit more. He said, I've had it for over a year now. I went to the doctor a while back. He said, oh, this is anxiety. You're going to have it the rest of your life, so let's get you on meds. And so he's now been taking meds, and it's just, he hates it. And I was asking him, well, anxiety is easy to get rid of. All you have to do is understand how the root got there. And then whatever process the root comes in is the process you get rid of the root. And I was asking him, scale of 0 to 10, how bad is it right now? Because I wanted to show him how this worked and to help him get rid of it. This is really interesting on the prayer line. I never pray for people. I always guide them in how to release these things on their own. So he said it was about a 4 at that moment. So I guided him through what I call the prayer freedom process, which is simply it's sort of like a 3-step process. You name it, locate it, and then you release it, okay? The naming it, he's already done that. I've got anxiety. Will you please pray for me? The hardest part is to locate where is the source of this. So I led him in a simple prayer, and it's interesting. It's not a religious prayer. So like if someone is not a part of a church, they don't even subscribe to religion as a whole, that's okay. Because it's a process that basically asks your inner being, we call it the conscience a lot of times, that God part of us. When we're created, I believe that God created us with a conscience, Drew, that gives us right and wrong, okay? When we do right, it says, you did right, yay! And when you do something bad, it says you're guilty, right? And you don't even have to be told that you're guilty. Well, that is actually like this communication line from God, is what I sense it is. So I led him in a prayer just asking God to reveal the source of this thing. And what came up was about a year earlier, year and a half earlier, he his wife actually had gone to the doctor for a breast exam, and they found lumps, but he became terribly afraid. And so now that we identified the source, being terribly afraid, and I guided him to release it to what the Bible says, says to confess your misalignment with God, and then you'll be healed. Okay, so here's the pattern. I'm trying to teach as I share this story, Drew. But the pattern is this. This guy's had anxiety. It started at a specific point in time. We were able to go back to that point, and it's when his wife had the exam and they found lumps. Now he becomes terribly afraid. So what's happened is this thing, I'll call it whatever you want to call it, but some root of anxiety comes into his being. And now he's got to get rid of that root. That root is a misalignment with how God designed us to live. And where you go back to the ancient Bible scriptures, they say, perfect love casts out fear. So the fact that there's fear, it means it's misaligned with God's perfect love. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you mentioned two aspects of this. You mentioned roots and you mentioned patterns. And so, I'm curious, in your work in helping people get free, what patterns do you begin to notice that
Yeah.
suggest that anxiety it can have deeper roots?
So it's patterns like this. I'll share a couple other stories in just a moment. But the pattern always is this pattern of something, and I'll use metaphorically, opens a doorway, right? Somehow anxiety comes in. And then you have to find that doorway and push it back out the same way it came in. Because it fits in that doorway. And unless you find that door, then you can't get rid of it. This is the issue. But that doorway lies in the spiritual dimension of our being, not in the physical or mental dimension. That's why you were asking the question about all kinds of mind effort and discipline and things that we do to control anxiety, why it never really works, is because we never really get rid of it. We only squash it. We try to compress it. It's raging at an 8 or 9, you take medication and brings it down to a 4. But it doesn't go out. And the reason it doesn't go out is because it's still there. So what we have to do is we have to learn how to release it. And the root of this man's anxiety was fear. So I guided him in a process of how to release it. It's all part of what I've done in my research with the ancient Bible text. And I guided him to release the fear, the hold that the fear has on him. And the basic thing that I guided him into is saying, God, I confess that holding on to fear is out of alignment with you, because you say perfect love casts out fear. So I now release my fear of what happened with my wife. And then that's the third step, right? Name it, locate it, release it. And by the end of the day, his anxiety was completely gone. And what happens, Drew, is I see this all the time. And this is where I was saying that anxiety is easy to get rid of. You just have to understand the pattern. Now, everyone's pattern is different. For him, it was something that happened with his wife. There was a young woman that came up to me about a year and a half ago, and she'd been dealing with night terrors for years. So I led her in the same process. She named it. Now let's ask God to identify where is the source. And this is the simplistic version, right? There's a little bit more what I'll call kind of recipe in the process to make it work. But the idea is to ask God, where is the source of this? And eventually something came up that occurred in her early childhood. And so I guided her in releasing that, and she's had no night terrors ever since. So you're asking about the patterns, and the patterns that I see, and I see this with almost everything that happens in our life. So anxiety is one of the biggest things, right? This is the one of the things that's driving right now so many people. You see fear, you see this tension, this underlying, nothing gets calm in your life. Even if things seem to be going okay in your life, there's still this underlying tension of something's going to happen. And it's getting worse. And the pattern is there's always a source. Years back, my wife suffered with panic attacks, and when she went to college, she didn't go away from home. She stayed local because she was just so anxious all the time, and she wasn't sure she could handle going out of town for college. And I didn't realize this, but a few years back, after going through this process and learning how this is in the early stages of creating what I now call the prayer of freedom, I started to realize with my wife, I think there's something in that spiritual dimension. We'll talk about the spiritual dimension in just a moment. But I led her to go through the same process. And it took a little bit of time. We were driving back from Orlando and guided her through this process. And ever since then, she doesn't have panic attacks anymore. She doesn't have anxiety anymore. Even her allergies have started to go down. She used to be torn up with allergies all the time. So there's just so much that happens in our lives that we don't realize how much of it is the roots are actually in the spiritual dimension of ours as opposed to the physical dimension. Is this making sense?
Yeah, I love that, the imagery of a root, and the roots, without getting rid of the spiritual root, all the other uh, steps really are just superficial
Yeah.
and not permanent, and maybe not even helpful, usually expensive,
Yes.
time consuming. I was just thinking, another image that came to mind is the idea of, and I'm just recently dealing with this, where you get a thorn under your skin. You can't necessarily see it, but it's there, and you can scratch it, you can rub it, you can put a Band-Aid on it, you can put topical creams on it, but until you get the thorn out, it's just going to kind of keep getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
You gotta excise the thorn, so to speak. Oh,
Yeah.
that's
Let
fantastic.
me
Yeah.
give you kind of a picture to start to understand this with. What I find with these patterns, Drew, is um, once you understand the pattern of life, how life operates, and I'm going to share it in this three-legged stool concept. But before I get there, I want to tell you the end result with it.
Okay.
Once you understand the pattern, I'm taking the prayer of freedom, and I teach as a volunteer at an addiction recovery center. They house 500 women. And by using this same pattern, this same framework of how things operate, I'm seeing, I measured it, so I can tell you this number. 87% of the women going through that process, which is chapter 12 in my book. It's kind of like a step-by-step process that I give them the book during our 6-week teaching term, and I give them space to do chapter 12 all on their own. So they're going through and making a list of these things that, as they're asking God to identify just where are they misaligned with what He has wanted for them to be, where they could then release that misalignment. 87% of those ladies are seeing everything in their life go to zero. What I did is I was teaching 3 classes at the time, and I gave them all a sheet of paper and say, make a list of everything that you're going through, everything that is out of whack in your life, darkness in your mind, heaviness like you're carrying around a heavyweight backpack, voices in your head, your mind just doesn't shut off, it's constantly running all the time, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, to sicknesses like COPD, allergies, asthma, to chronic pains, fibromyalgia, arthritis, joint pain, knee pain, sciatica, migraines, and then addictions, addiction urges to sex, drugs, alcohol, pornography. And so all the people in my 3 classes made a list of those things and rated the intensity on a 0 to 10 scale, 10 being worse. So that became the benchmark, right? And then I gave them chapter 12 and I said, do this on your own and do it in 1 month. And then at the end of the month, for those people who went through it, we regraded their list. 87% of those women, everything on their list except maybe one for every third person, everything went to a 0. And what that started to show me, Drew, is this pattern that starts with anxiety is the same pattern that tends to be ruling our lives with chronic pains and persistent sicknesses and addictions. And I'm seeing it even with relationship squabbles and conflicts. Not that this is a magic pill or silver bullet. Not that every sickness or every anxiety is tied to this. But I'm seeing, generally speaking, as people go through this, I'm seeing like a 90% of the issues in their lives disappearing. If you or a loved one are dealing with any form of anxiety or depression or chronic pain like arthritis, fibromyalgia, or migraines, if you're dealing with just persistent sicknesses all the time, constant allergies or asthma, COPD, or you're always on antibiotics or something like that, you can tell something's definitely happening in your life. If you or a loved one are dealing with addictions to drugs, sex, alcohol, pornography, smoking, gambling, I'm finding that most of these things have a spiritual root in our life, that if you get rid of the root, then the manifestation of those things just disappear. I'm seeing about a 90% success rate as people go through the prayer freedom process and doing it entirely on their own, going through a simple checklist process that I developed over the last 10 years that's helping them to identify areas in their life that they need to just to release and the specific process on how to release it. As I teach this at the Addiction Recovery Center, I'm finding these ladies getting free of all of these type of things and more in a 30-day period, simply doing it on their own. And I'm finding a lot of people getting free of things a lot quicker if they don't have as heavy of things as those ladies do. So I just want to encourage you that there's hope. And if you or a loved one struggling in anything like that, please visit the website. Just add a .com. It's theprayerfreedom.com. And just go to the website, theprayerfreedom.com. And there's more resources. There's some free information. There's some videos. And most importantly, a link that will take you straight to the book in major online sellers so you get the correct one rather than a look-alike one, because there are a lot of books on prayer and freedom. Also, I'd like to encourage you that if you're enjoying this teaching and you would like more of it, please subscribe. If there's a type of topic that you would like us to discuss, please, in the comments below, you should see them down below, just add a comment, ask the questions. I want to hear about this topic or that topic, as we start to go through different topics and start to dissect what's actually happening and how to get free of it. Also with that is, if you are dealing with anything that you would like to be healed from, or maybe you've already been healed from, maybe God or something's happened in your life and it's just disappeared, we'd love to hear from you on that. So please enter those comments below. And now, let's get back to the show. Reading one of the comments that someone was writing recently, they mentioned that they'd been smoking for 40 years and tried everything to stop. They go through the prayer freedom process, and now they've stopped smoking. So it's that pattern that's just constantly the foundational thing, and it's the Stool concept that I want to share in just a moment.
Well, that's an extraordinarily broad and mind-bending list of ailments that we just think of as emotional or mental or physical. So it sounds like then there's a spiritual root behind much or most then of these
That's what I'm
things that
finding. Yeah.
we would never think that. It would never cross our minds, perhaps, that would be the case, because that's just isn't how we think about things, I guess, the way we're
It's
trained.
not. And what started to clue me in on this is my father-in-law was an internal medicine doctor. He practiced. He died at right around 2000, 2002, somewhere in that time frame. And he'd been practicing medicine for 60 years. So he's the old school. Long before pharmaceuticals were the cure-all for everything. And right now we get over-drugged and under-healed. And what he kept telling his patients, and when I first met him, he was telling me this, this is his mantra. He said, health is based on three things: mental, physical, and spiritual. He says, anytime a patient would come to him with whatever problem, he'd sit them down and talk to them. Doctors don't talk anymore. They just run tests and prescribe meds. But he's the old school. He would talk to them, and he would start to analyze, is it a mental, physical, or spiritual thing that's happening in their life? And the spiritual is a non-religious spiritual. It's just that spiritual component. And he had one of the highest success rates of doctors in bringing freedom and healing into people's lives. And the majority of what he found was most of the things are on that spiritual part of us. What's happening in our medical and healthcare system now is we've become agnostic and atheistic. Now it's either mental or physical. This is where pharmaceuticals come in. Something to drive the mental thinking, something to drive the biological thinking, right? Biological process. They totally eliminate the third part. And that's why I think people are staying stuck all the time. And you find people who've been going to the doctor, going to the psychiatrist, going to counseling, and if it was really successful, you would see success rates. What happens is nothing, you never stop. And that should be the clue that if I have to keep taking these meds, I have to keep going back to counseling, I have to keep going back to therapy of some sort, then, wake up. The root's still there. All we're doing is we're running the lawnmower over it, trying to keep it hidden,
Sure.
but it's not curing anything.
Managing symptoms
Managing
for
symptoms.
the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Managing symptoms.
So
not
let me
getting
share
rid of
this
the
way of looking at life. It's a simple framework, but once I share it, I think it'll make just a lot of sense. And that is a three-legged stool. So I've got a three-legged stool. It's made out of wood. And as long as all three legs are strong, that stool is sturdy. You can jump up on down on it. You can carry a heavy load on it. And it's just going to stay really steady. That stool represents our being. And there are three legs to our being. You have the mental, the physical, and the spiritual leg. But watch this. Once one of those legs get out of whack, let's say that spiritual leg gets out of alignment, it gets unscrewed a little bit, it gets fractured a little bit, it's weakened. What that does is when you have a three-legged stool and one leg is weak, it puts stress on the other two legs. And it doesn't take a lot of stress. Watch this. I have a glass of water. It weighs maybe a pound. Okay? No stress for me at all. I can hold it. But now watch what happens if I have to hold this for an hour. Ooh, my arm starts to hurt. If I have to hold it for 24 hours, next to impossible. In other words,
Sure.
even though it's a little thing, the longer I hold it, the more stress it puts on my body because there's no chance to recover, no chance to rest. Is this making sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. No,
So,
that's fantastic.
so you
Well, I
take
meant, yeah.
you,
Go
you,
ahead.
you take that concept now and you do something that you get out of alignment with how God designed us to live. That conscience in us that tells us right or wrong, okay? You get out of alignment just a little bit. And it seems like no big deal. We can handle it. But what we don't realize is when we stay out of alignment, that peace in our life thins and it melts away, and it's so gradual we don't even realize it. It's like that frog you put in a pot of room temperature water and slowly to turn up the heat. He'll just sit there and cook without even knowing it. He doesn't realize the change. It's so gradual. But once you reverse that change, boom, I'm seeing the reversal so much faster than the onset. And all it takes is understanding that third leg and how to identify the location of what we're holding on to. And then watch this. Most people, when they're dealing with anxiety, they're also dealing with other issues in their life. Panic attacks,
Sure.
maybe nightmares or night terrors. They're dealing with maybe ongoing sickness. Usually they'll have depression or aches and pains, dealing with sciatica. In other words, once you get that third leg out of whack a little bit, it's likely that something else happens in your life and you get it out of whack a little bit more there. And so we go through life never fully understanding how to respond to our conscience that says, hey, you need to let that go. You need to go apologize. You need to go do whatever. And we push back on it and say, I don't need to do that. And we don't think there's any real consequence. But then we end up with anxiety, on meds, little aches and pains. I was leading this one lady, her name is Wendy. She had been dealing with sciatica for like over 20 years. Down the neck, across her shoulders, down the back, down into her big toe. And it wasn't constant, but it was always present, sometimes more powerful than others. And I led her through the prayer freedom approach. And some things started to surface in her life from years back that she hadn't even thought about. And I guided her how to release it. And she texted me the next day and said, all of my pain's gone. No more sciatica pain, no more shoulder pain, no more shooting pain down my leg, and even my big toe hasn't been bothering me at all. And I saw her again like a year later, and it's never come back. And so we live with these things, Drew, and we think it's normal. This is just normal life. But it's not. Isn't that amazing?
My goodness. Well, I imagine there's some folks out there with anxiety who are leaning in, listening with both ears. You've said some pretty remarkable things. I I think a question that would come up would be, so how would someone recognize if their anxiety or their intrusive thoughts or perpetual mind, the nonstop voices, if it's actual spiritual rather than just emotional?
Yeah,
Like
so
how might
that's
they know?
from my experience, 90% of the time, I see those things disappear by handling it as a third leg, misalignment on the spiritual dimension of our life. So the bigger question is, how can someone recognize if it's not spiritual, right? Hey, if the most likely thing is that spiritual part of us, something out of alignment, then how do I recognize if it's not that? Because here's the best way to answer your question. And I don't want to sound, I don't want this come across the wrong way. But the way my father-in-law would practice medicine is he would diagnose someone and say, I think it's this. So let's try this remedy. If this remedy works, then I got the diagnosis right because it always works on this. And but it could be something else because sometimes the symptom can look very similar to another symptom. So if this remedy doesn't work, then it might be this other thing, but it's very rarely this other thing. So then we'll try a different remedy on that one. In other words, it's diagnosis by trial and error. And the same thing with anxiety. How do you know if it's coming from that spiritual side of us, the third-legged root, the spiritual root on that third leg? Is best way to try it is go through the prayer freedom process. And if it still remains, then it's likely not a spiritual root. It could be something a little bit different. But if it goes away, then you know that it must have been that.
Well, it sounds very common sense. I mean, that kind of approach is kind of a nice blend of humility mixed with logic.
Yeah.
Start with the least intrusive
Can
potential remedy, right?
Hey,
If it works, great. If it doesn't, okay, we move to the next thing.
I want to, as we're speaking on anxiety, I want to share a story. This is in my book, The Prayer of Freedom, okay? And you can get it at theprayerfreedombook.com. But, and just for the listeners, the way the book is set up is the first half of it is an explanation. I did a lot of research into the ancient Bible texts that tend to be highly accurate when it comes to spiritual truths and especially what I call spiritual laws. So I would research the text and then I would go test it in real life and started to see these spiritual law patterns play out. So the first half of this is going through an understanding of what appears to be going on from the ancient Bible text. It said this thousands of years ago, and here's what I'm seeing today, okay? And then it moves into the second half, and the second half starts basically with chapter 12. And chapter 12 is this process that I've developed that's pretty thorough to help people with all kinds of things. And I want to read you just one story. This is in my book, from a lady named Ashlin. And she had endured severe childhood trauma at an early age, like at 5 and 6 years old. So a lot of times if people are dealing with anxiety, here's what I do find. It's real interesting. Very few people have what I call adult onset anxiety. It's usually something they've been dealing with since childhood, because most of the severe anxiety either has come down through, your mom or dad had anxiety, and their mom or dad had anxiety, now you have anxiety. So we see this pattern, okay? This pattern comes down. Other times it's things like what happened with Ashlin. And I want to show you, I want to read this to you because I want you to see that this isn't permanent. Even though the healthcare system can't find a solution, I want you to see how quickly this solution occurred. So this is Ashlin, and this was just a little message that she wrote. She said, I suffered with crippling anxiety, PTSD, and mental illness ever since experiencing horrific trauma from men when I was a little girl. So she was abused and molested. It left me constantly afraid. Every morning I would wake up terrified, absolutely sure something bad was going to happen. My mind never stopped racing. It was 24/7. So for anyone who's dealing with heavy anxiety, you'll recognize this. And keep watching. This is what happened. She said, doctors had me on a heavy cocktail of medications just to function. 400 milligrams of Seroquel a day, plus Buspirone, Zoloft, and sleep meds. I'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, and severe anxiety. I honestly believed I'd be on medication for the rest of my life. She was, at this time, she was about 26, 27 years old when she came through my class. So, as with everyone, I gave her a copy of my book. I said, y'all do chapter 12 on your own. So now she said, I went through the prayer of freedom, that chapter 12, and the very next morning I woke up and everything was different. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't terrified. For the first time since childhood, I felt peace and calm. When I met with my psychiatrist, she looked at me and said, if you feel this good, you don't need the meds. So I stopped and I haven't needed them since. That was over 6 months ago. She said, I can't even describe what it's like to wake up and not feel afraid, to not need medication just to get through the day. I'm free, and I never thought I would be. And so what happened with her is your question, how do you know if something has a spiritual root?
Right.
Well, it definitely wasn't a chemical root because she was on all the chemicals that man could prescribe. It definitely wasn't a counseling and therapy route because she'd been to counseling and therapy for 10, 15 years at least. So then she tried the spiritual route and it all disappeared. That's what I'm seeing, Drew, is so much of our life, when we turn away from recognizing there's a spiritual dimension of our life, our life tends to keep thinning in peace. And what used to be this, what may never have been, but what could always have been this beautiful life starts to fade away. And now we live a life of constant stress, constant irritability. Like in my neighborhood, we had a lady move in a few years back, and you'd see her walking on the streets, and she'd be walking kind of stiff-legged and stiff neck, stiff arm, and just like really upset. She was just like, she's got, something crawling up her backside somewhere, right? Just like, it was just, you could see her. And then when she's driving, it's like a little bat out of hell. Whoa, 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 all through the neighborhood. And then she has on the back of her bumper a bumper sticker that says, I run to get the crazies out. So what happens is she recognizes something's out of whack. She's got these crazies in her, and she gets this bumper sticker because it's so perfect for her. She's always she's super fit. She's always exercising, trying to calm these things. But that's outside discipline and effort trying to get rid of an inside problem. And the problem is that the problem never happened from the outside. It's always something, for her, it's something on the inside. And so we go through life with this constant stream and tension in her life, irritability. Others, anxiousness. Others, low depression or high depression, whatever it may be. And there's a solution. I remember a few years back, a friend of mine named Bob just been served divorce papers, and it just knocked him, backwards and forwards, and he was so upset, concerned, fearful, depressed, everything. And his marriage was on the rocks anyway, so like it wasn't. It was like, hey, it's not like it's out of the blue. You just didn't expect it to come this soon, right? It's one of those things. So I was guiding him through the prayer freedom process one night over at my house. And after a little bit of time, 30, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, because there's just a lot there, I was asking him, how do you feel? He said, I feel like 1,000 pounds of bricks have been lifted off my shoulders. And where my mind was always dark, it's like perfect light now, light and clear. And just this tremendous change. And I said, well, as you continue to go through this process, because this is a process, it's not like a one and done. It's just a process of understanding how to begin to engage with that third leg in your life, and asking God to just start to reveal things. And things come to the surface. And if you can imagine, as they come to your surface, you just release it. And more things come up, you release it. And so what had happened with him on just that night, a number of things came up, but it wasn't everything. But it was like radical change. Then I was telling him, I said, Bob, as you continue to go through this process, your life will become so perfect that you'll be pinching yourself like there's nothing hitting me, no attacks, nothing. It's just, it doesn't matter what's happening on the outside of your world, inside, you're rock solid. And he looked at me with these longing, hopeful eyes and said, are you serious? Can life really be that way? And I said, yeah, that's how we live. My family and I have been living this way for years. So fast forward now, I see him again about 1.5 years later. He comes up to me at a party, gives me this great big bear hug, and he's almost crying. And he said, thank you. And his life has totally changed. He's lost 30 pounds. He's totally at peace inside. Everything's solid. Now, backstory, he lost the divorce. She took every dime that he had, all of his inheritance, took the house, took the kids. She's been poisoning the kids against him. So the relationship is broken with him and half of his kids. They have 4 kids. And yet, life is so full of peace. And this is what I was talking about, Drew. When your stool, that 3-legged stool, is solid, it doesn't matter what's coming at you from the outside. It can't penetrate. Because it's like there's this force field around you that it stops. And inside, you're totally at peace.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the story was extraordinary up until you're talking about what actually happened to him in the divorce, and he's still that way.
Yes.
That's just that's almost I won't say that's beyond belief because it's believable, I guess, but that's extraordinary. Is that so? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say a simple metaphor. Years back, we were taking our family on a travel trip. We were all loaded up in the minivan. We're driving through Montana, a terrible rainstorm, and it felt like pellets hitting our windshield and the roof. It was, you couldn't even hear yourself talk. It was that loud. So this is the picture of how life can be once you understand this pattern. Okay, this is what was happening with his life. On the outside, there is a raging storm. But on the inside, the temperature is perfect. There's no water. It's constantly it's peaceful. It won't be soundproof, but none of us are wet and none of us are uncomfortable, even though we're going through the midst of a storm. That's how life can be.
Well, I can only imagine that there's folks watching this and listening, and they're thinking, how do I get free from this anxiety that I have? What I need this process. And are there some mistakes, some directions that you'd recommend folks don't go as they go down this
Yeah,
path?
I say this humorously, not sarcastically, not critically, but to some degree quite seriously as well.
Okay.
Don't go to the doctor. If you've been to the doctor over and over again, the proof is in the pudding, right? Like if you hire a coach to lead your football team to championships and he's been your coach now for several years and they haven't won a game, time to get a new coach, right? Continuing the same activity and expecting a different result is insanity. So don't keep doing the same thing if you want to get free. If you're happy at status quo, then the same thing will keep you there, okay?
Sure.
What I wanted to do, I thought would be helpful, is to take a deeper dive into this. If you think about this, this whole concept of this third leg, the spiritual dimension of ours, as a swimming pool. Okay, the water is that spiritual dimension. What I've been doing is I've been taking you in from the shallow end, the zero entry, and kind of guiding you in. And now we're near the middle part of the swimming pool. And I want to take you a little bit deeper toward the deeper end. So maybe the process of what goes on starts to make more sense. Would that be okay?
Okay. I think that's what everybody wants to hear.
Okay, great. So first, let me give you the framework, okay? And I want to say this as a framework because I'm not saying this is fact because I've never seen any of this. But I try to, as a scientist, I try to see the patterns that I'm experiencing when I guide people through a process and I look at the outcomes and the outcomes keep lining up the same pattern, right? And we're dealing with something that we cannot see. I can't see into the spiritual dimension of life. But I can sense that there's something there. I sense it in my heart. My conscience tells me something was right or something wrong, and no one told that to me, but my heart did. But I also see these patterns that defy randomness. And so I create this concept of a framework. And for some people, if you ever heard of Einstein's theory of relativity, I have no idea what it is. I know what it's E equals mc squared. I have no clue what it really means. But here's what I do understand. Number one, it's still a theory. It's not a proven fact. But by applying the framework that this theory gives you, it's allowed man to split the atom. It's allowed man to create jet airplanes. It's allowed us to put satellites into orbit and put a man on the moon. So using a framework that's not necessarily factual, it's proving very successful already. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
So with that as the backdrop, this framework is not necessarily what is going on, but it's how I see a pattern that makes sense in what could be going on. And when I test it, it allows me to say, well, if this works for anxiety, let's try the same pattern for depression. Let's try the same pattern for arthritis. Let's try that same pattern for allergies. Let's try it for addictions. Let's try it for family breakup, where you're constantly battling your relationships all the time. And I'm finding that this framework holds up fairly well. So I want to give you a metaphorical picture, okay? And that picture is this. Taking the physical pattern of a weed that has roots that's underneath the ground. Those roots start to amplify the weed to come up. You cut the weed off with your lawnmower, but those roots are amplifiers that then restore whatever you cut off and keeps pushing it up. And if you leave it untended, then it's going to push so much weed out, it's just going to take over your yard. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
I use the word amplifier because it takes just a little bit and it keeps magnifying it and pushing it forward. So take that metaphor and now let's move it to this third leg of our life, this spiritual dimension. And the spiritual dimension says, let's use the guy with anxiety that I talked about. So he gets afraid. He gets real fearful because his wife has lumps. The doctor says this could be cancer. So now what happens is, in a very picturesque standpoint, is it's almost like something in that spiritual side of our life opens up, and now there's this thing, roots of fear start to take place. They get planted in the spiritual side of his life, and now they start to push forward into his surface side, the weed of anxiety. The roots are in the spiritual because he somehow planted the spiritual root when he got afraid and did not release it. And now it's causing him, you can call it a mental loop if you want to use a kind of a scientific term, there's a mental looping that he is just constantly afraid, and as it keeps looping, it pushes anxiety. And it keeps it constant. No matter how much mind control he does, therapy and counsel or medication, it will control how intense that anxiety is, but it never gets rid of it because it's actually the root system is over here in the spiritual side. So anytime we do something where we're getting out of alignment of that conscience, out of alignment with what our inner being says that was wrong. If I just slug you out of the blue, my conscience is going to say, "Why'd you do that? That was totally wrong." I said, "But he's a jerk. He deserved it." No, that's wrong. This is my conversation. And I squash down on my conscience and say, "No, I know what's best." So now I'm out of alignment somewhere. That's that spiritual leg, right? So now what happens is something happens in this third part of me, this spiritual side, and I've got a root growing. And that root amplifies that anger that I felt toward you or whoever it was that I hit. And if I allow that root to stay alive, then it constantly pushes anger into my life. So it's coming from the spiritual side, but it pushes it into the physical side. Is this?
Yeah, that makes it literally could be that root of fear that then amplifies into anxiety, into torment, the root of anger that's unresolved that turns into rage and it comes forward as that way.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah.
am I picking it up?
The root of addiction. I start to get drunk, and now there's this root of addiction to alcohol, and I keep urging. There's something that drives that urge, and part of this, you'll also notice this is another pattern that I see, and a lot of times, in the world of psychology, a lot of times they'll think of it as maybe like a mental loop, something that your mind just keeps. It can't let go of it. It just keeps looping, almost like your computer's in a death spiral loop and it just locks up, right? That is how some people view it, and what I view it as that loop originates back here in that third leg, and it keeps things constantly present in your mind. So this starts to explain why when, like the lady in our neighborhood, my guess is something happened many years back that she got really upset as someone and just never dealt with it, just kind of squashed it. I'm going to move on with my life. She forgets about the event. But now there's this, metaphorically, there's this root of anger, and it keeps this mental loop constantly running through her life, and it'll never turn off. So she tries to get all of that energy out. When you're angry, you're full of energy. You want to go fight, right? The adrenaline. So she's constantly exercising, trying to control it, trying to get the crazies out. And it doesn't get the crazies out. It makes her look great. She's very fit. but it doesn't get the crazies out. The crazy's still there. And so what we have to do is we have to be able to go back and identify that root. We have to give ourselves that inner being. This is where this prayer process, God, would you reveal through my conscience, or however you want to, if you're religious, God, tell me, show me. If you're not religious, God, if you're out there, then speak through my conscience, whatever. But what happens is you give yourself permission to start to identify where this problem is located, right? I've named it. I want to get rid of this anxiety, this anger, this irritation, because it keeps cropping up and you can't control it. This is where I was going. Because it's always there, there's no way to control it by discipline. That's why the least little thing, you'll go into a panic attack if it's anxiety. If it's anger, irritability, the least little thing, and you blow up at someone. If it's addiction to something, you can try to say, my discipline, I'll not do it, I don't want to do it, I don't want, and eventually you do it. Hey, real quick before we get to the end of our discussion, I just want to come back on and just encourage you that if any of this topic has been resonating in your heart because there are some things either in your life or the life of a loved one that you've been struggling with, that you're wanting to get free, that the prayer of freedom really can be a good solution for you. And by the end of the show, please go on over to the website at theprayerfreedom.com and just check it out. There's some free resources there, some other information, some videos, and a link to get directly to the correct book. Also, if this has been really helpful for you, please subscribe to our channel. We put out a lot more content like this. If there are specific topics that you want to hear about, or specific sicknesses or ailments that you want to learn more how to get free of, please enter those in the comments, because we check the comments and they help us decide what type of topics and things to talk on. And then finally, if there's any sort of things that you personally experience in terms of healing, then we would love to hear that as well. So please enter that. And now let's get back to the final part of our discussion. Because there's something, this is the way I like to describe it sometimes. It's kind of crude, but I think everyone can relate to this. We try to squash these things with mental effort and control. I'm going to stop my mind from constantly thinking on it. I'm going to think good thoughts, not scary or negative thoughts. Or for addictions, hey, you just need to suck it up and just say no. Just say no. And that's all it takes. But what happens is it's sort of like when you have to go to the bathroom. You're at a meeting, you can hold it. And so by act of your will and discipline, you can hold it. But at some point, you can't. Because there's something besides your mind and your will that's at play. And if you're not careful, the root of what's coming out is going to push it out anyway. And so that happens in the physical, but in the pattern is the same thing happens in the spiritual. There's this root, and it's going to have its way eventually until you get rid of it. And that's where this whole process of the prayer of freedom starts to get rid of it. I've got to share one other story on this.
Oh, please. Yeah.
This is one of the ladies, when I did this test and measured it at the Addiction Recovery Center, this was a thank you note one of those ladies gave me. And it wasn't, and I want to be very careful with how I say this. You'll see a lot of stories in my book because they're so plentiful. This is one of them, and it's not that I'm searching for stories in a desert with no real proof. It's like this is a fertile garden, and I just pick whatever fruit is closest by. That's what you see because it's so successful. And people that have been stuck in things for so long, they're finding that this process ends all the mental looping, if that's what you call it, all the urges, whatever it is, this thing from that third leg of our life, it's puts it back in correction and things start to disappear. So this is a lady named Katherine. She said, I want to thank you for the prayer of freedom. It has changed my life. Growing up, my relationship with my mom was really tough. She was abusive, and she and my stepdad would drink and get into lots of fights. By the time I was in 7th grade, she said she didn't want anything to do with me and left. Can you imagine as a 7th grade girl, your mom saying, I'm through with you. You're on your own. I'm out of here. And she said, that's when life began spiraling downward. By 16 years old, I was having sex with lots of boys and started getting into drugs. That was just over 10 years ago. Before doing this prayer, I was addicted to heroin and fentanyl and meth. I had a lot of worry and stress and anxiety. On a scale of 1 to 10, they were probably an 8. I've had constant allergies and sinus headaches for years, migraines 5 out of 7 days a week, and a super heavy feeling like I was carrying around an overweight backpack every day. Life has really been difficult. But the prayer of freedom and releasing these things changed everything. Literally everything is gone. No more sinus issues, all gone. No more headaches and migraines, all gone. No more heaviness, it's all gone. No more anxiety or stress or worries. Literally on a scale of 1 to 10, they've all gone to 0. Even my addictions have gone down to 0. I don't want drugs anymore. I have no urges for them anymore. And even the thought of any drug disgusts me. It's all gone. Isn't that amazing?
Sounds like a completely new life.
It's a completely new life. It's that same life that I was telling Bob, the one that went through a divorce. It said, as you go through this process, your life will become so free and so at peace and solid that it's a totally new life. And he couldn't understand how his life could be that way because he had never experienced it.
That's extraordinary. Well, I'll tell you, I've got to ask if someone's listening today, they've been struggling with anxiety for years, they feel stuck. What's the one thing that you want them to remember from this conversation?
The one thing is there is hope. The hope is in the process that I, in over 10 years, have put together into a step-by-step process that these people are going through. It's called the Prayer of Freedom. You'll see it behind me. You can find information about it at theprayeroffreedom.com. And there's some more details there. You'll actually see me doing some live demonstrations with people that I've done on shows where they're dealing with anxiety and depression for 26 years, or neuropathy in their legs for 15 years, or knee pain from football injuries over 20 years earlier, all kinds of things like that. And you'll see me guiding them through this process. Now, we trimmed it down to make it short, but it happens relatively quick. Once you identify where the spiritual root is, it can happen quickly. It's the process of identifying that spiritual root, which is the key, and then how to release it. So I would go to theprayeroffreedom.com and check it out. There's a lot of resources there, and most important is a direct link to being able to get the book either on Amazon or any other bookseller. There are a lot of books on prayer and freedom, and you don't want to get the wrong one. Okay, so that's why I would suggest going to the website directly, theprayeroffreedom.com.
Well, Beatty, thank you so very much. I can't wait to hear more stories as they come in from people. It sounds like, to your point, you're sharing so much proof, so many stories, so many examples, video captured release or freedom or healing. Because to your point, if you may not be able to see what's going on, right? This is sort of invisible to us, but if it works, the proof is there. So
Yeah.
you're showing it over, help people get over that unbelief about it. Give it a try. That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Beatty.
Well, thank you, Drew. Appreciated being on your show and looking forward to maybe the next time.
Absolutely. Thank you all.